Welcome all to today's seminar. I'd like first to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land on which our campuses stand and pay my respects and our collective respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend a warm welcome to any of them who may be joining us today. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us this afternoon. It's morning in Paris, where Thomas-Oliver Leautier is sitting and about to address us. I'm going to briefly introduce him, if you don't mind, because this is somebody it's a person we don't really know well in Australia, but we definitely should. Thomas is a professor of management science at the Toulouse School of Economics. He's also chief economist at Électricité de France, which is the largest generation company in France and the traditional incumbents in the French market. He received his PhD from MIT, where he studied under the guidance of Paul Josko, whom we know, and not one, but two Nobel laureates, being Jean Tirole and Bengt Holmström. Thomas is a very interesting character. He's forged a very rich and diverse career path in industry, in consulting, in academia. He's also the author of a book, textbook, titled Imperfect Markets and Imperfect Regulation, which I'm attempting to show to the camera. And of this book, I will say one thing only. Jean Tirole says, I cannot think of anyone better qualified to write this book. Leautier is heir to the tradition of French ingénieur economists, among them is Marcel Boiteau. And of course, Tirole himself is one of these people. So quite an endorsement from Jean Tirole. And now over to you, Thomas. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. As you guys can see, I'm sitting in my typical French kitchen. You can see a bottle of wine on the side here, and you can see the traditional fridge on the back. I'm not going to talk to you about my French kitchen, which is not very interesting. I'm going to talk to you about a working paper I've done with Richard Green a few years ago. But before I do that, I really want to tell you how excited I am to be here. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Guillaume, for inviting me. I'm delighted to address you. I wish I could have gone in person, but you know, life is a bit complicated these days. So I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm going to share the paper. It's a bit oldish, but I think the equations and the insights remain valid. Please do not hesitate to ask any questions through the chat as we go, because some of the questions may be better answered immediately rather than later. So work with Richard Green, with a colleague at Imperial College. Okay, so that should move down. There you go. The focus of the work was on renewable entry. And when we started working on that paper, that was 5 or 6 years ago, academia takes a long time to finish a paper. When we started working on the paper, the renewables were just entering the market. And they were starting to have an impact, but the bigger impact at the time was the tax we had to pay to subsidize renewable. So the paper was focused on the dynamics of the market when renewable enter, but also on the dynamics of the tax when renewable enter. And that's why you see that. What we did is we did two things, which I think are relevant to you guys. One is we determined analytically the laws of motion. We essentially wrote down the equation that govern the change in variables such as the tax, the subsidies, the capacity of incumbent generation when renewable enter. And as usual, having equation help you explain what happens and gives you a frame of mind as to what happened. But then we did another thing, which is we ran the numbers on Great Britain. Richard has a great model of renewables in Great Britain. He had a lot of wind data, which enabled us to actually test the analytical findings on Great Britain and see what would happen. What we found is a couple of insights. The first one, which hopefully you will find clear at the end of the talk is that if you subsidize entry by renewables, of course, they're going to displace existing generation. That's the point, right? You want to subsidize renewable, you want to make renewables enter so that they can move out other generation sources, presumably polluting generation sources, and reduce emissions. That's what you want to do. However, it's a bit more tricky than that. And what we found with Richard, both analytically and empirically, is that which incumbent generation source gets pushed out depends on the nature of the renewable entry. So in Great Britain, renewables are essentially wind turbines, mostly offshore wind, but maybe also some onshore wind turbines. Remember that Boris Johnson said that he wanted to make Great Britain the Saudi Arabia of wind. So it's going to be mostly wind turbines. And because Great Britain has different wind regimes, and because of the way it is shaped, wind on average blows about uniformly across the island. Hence, wind generation produces about uniformly every hour of the year. I'm not saying it's perfect, but because of the covariance, because of the diversification across the different regimes, wind produces about as a base load in Great Britain. So if you subsidize entry of renewables, which produces a base load, the technology that's going to be pushed out is going to be the base load technology. In the case of Great Britain, it's going to be nuclear technology. And that's an insight we go both analytically, but we also illustrated it numerically with the model that Richard had developed. So that was our first insight. The second insight is about the dispatch rule. It's a bit more technical, but I think it's essential to understand that. When you add renewables to the mix, they produce at zero marginal cost. So they essentially get priority dispatch. That is, because they cost nothing to operate, they should be the first one being dispatched all the time. So far, so good. But in some instances, the other technologies are inflexible. That is, that especially, I think in Australia, you have a lot of coal-fired power plants. It's really expensive to shut down a coal-fired power plant for a few hours and turn it back up again. So you could get a case where demand is lower than wind production. And if you allow all the wind production into the system, then you're going to see negative prices because the generation, the coal-fired generation will not turn down. So you're going to see negative prices. And that is, of course, not a good idea. So the second insight was around the dispatch rule. And instead of being physical priority dispatch, that is always dispatching the wind, we said we should keep it financial insurance as opposed to physical dispatch. So this is the model. And I'm going to walk through some of the main results with you, and then we can take some Q&A. The standard model of power markets, it's actually quite old. It dates from about 1948, 49. Lucky us, it was developed in France by Marcel Boiteux, and it's a peak load pricing model. So the intuition is that you have on the x-axis the capacity that is being installed. On the y-axis, you have the price. And because I wrote with Richard, it was in pounds per megawatt hours, but you can use it in Australian dollars per megawatt hours or euros or US dollars. And you see demand curve. Demand are, in our model, it's a simple model. Demand is assumed to be downward sloping. So if you increase the price, people want to consume less electricity. There could be a debate and there could be an entire lecture or seminar on whether demand is downward sloping, but for the sake of the paper, we assume it is downward sloping. And demand varies across the different hours of the year. So on the left-hand side of my graph, you see demand, for example, or in France, that would be a summer morning when demand is very low. On the right-hand side of the graph, you see demand on a winter evening when demand is at the highest. So you see demand varies across the time of the day. And then you have generation technology, and we have an optimal generation mix. So in black now, I trace the supply curve, actually the supply curve. In the paper we researched, we assume three distant technology, nuclear, which is the baseload technology, which produces at every hour. And we assume that nuclear is inflexible, which means you cannot reduce production from nuclear. So if you install 10 gigawatts, you produce 10 gigawatts at every hour. Combined cycle, CCGT, which of course is flexible. And for the peaking hours, you get the open cycle gas turbines. And what you see is the marginal cost. So the price is at the intersection of the demand and the supply curves. So here you get a slightly negative price. The second one, you get a price that's determined by demand. Then you get all this horizontal line where the price is at the variable cost of gas. On that second horizontal line, price is at the variable cost of the open cycle gas turbines. And on the vertical bits of the supply curve, price is determined by the marginal valuation. So that's a standard supply curve. That's a standard equilibria in power markets. Now, when you add renewables to the mix, because renewables are producing at zero marginal cost, as I said before, you're always going to dispatch to renewables. So you're always going to want to have the renewable producing at the maximum they can produce. So which means that the demand that is going to be addressed by the incumbent technologies is going to be the demand less the production of renewables. So essentially your demand curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so I'm going to do it again. That's an animation that Richard did, which I'm very proud of. The demand curve is shifting to the left because you take the demand and you subtract the renewables production. So if your demand curve is going to shift to the left, then your equilibrium, your long-term equilibrium generation capacity is also going to shift to the left because all of a sudden, this incumbent technology have lower demand to meet because some of it is already met by renewables. So you have to reduce your incumbent technologies too. And that's what you want. When you subsidize the entry of renewable, is because you say we want to produce less electricity with CO2 emitting technology, in that case it's gas, and therefore we make renewable enter and they will push out CO2 emitting technologies. And that's what we expect, that's what we hope, and that's what the model does. And I see there are questions, I'm going to take them. I'm just going to close the model for you and then I'm going to take the question. There's a subsidy for renewables. We assume in that case that the subsidy is a tax paid on every unit. So the new equilibrium in the market is going to take into account this tax. So we're going to see different things, but we're going to see lower incumbent generation technology, and we're going to see a bit of tax, and the new equilibrium, the new long-term equilibrium is going to be characterized by those things. And I see there are two questions. I'm going to take that now. If nuclear is inflexible, why would it be replaced in dispatch rather than gas? That's a very good question. I'm sorry, I've not been clear about that. If nuclear is inflexible, in the dispatch, it keeps producing at every hour. But in the long-term equilibrium, and that goes to the second question, there will be negative prices, or the prices nuclear will receive will be lower. So in the long-term equilibrium, nuclear will be exiting the market because it will be pushed out by lower prices, and in some instances, negative prices. So the second question by David is, why do wholesale prices go negative? Well, what happens is that, and I'm going to give you an example that illustrates the point, and then we'll go into negative pricing. I'm pretty sure in Australia there are hours where the demand is lower than the capacity, or demand at the overnight is lower than the capacity, the coal-fired capacity that is available in the evening and in the morning. So let's take an example. The demand is about 8 at night. The capacity that the demand in the morning and in the evening is 10. So you have coal-fired plants that produce 10 in the evening and 10 in the morning. So now the coal-fired plant is asking itself, well, am I going to shut down overnight to produce, to start producing again in the morning? So I'm going to incur shutdown costs in the evening and startup costs in the morning, or am I going to just keep producing overnight? And most power plants, most coal-fired power plants say, well, look, the startup cost is too expensive, so I'm going to be producing overnight, and I'm going to accept to produce a price that is lower than my variable cost. So I'm going to produce at a lower than variable cost, and because I'm producing low, maybe demand will come up. I'm sorry, the price will be lower, demand will be higher, and then therefore I'm going to accept overnight a price lower than my variable cost, but that will compensate for the shutdown and startup costs. And that we see a lot. Negative prices is just an extreme of that case. It's an extreme of that case because the renewable producers, they produce, they're given priority dispatch. So whatever megawatt hour they produce, and they get paid in the schemes we're discussing, they get paid a fixed price. Those were subsidies they were receiving a fixed price contract. So they produce as much as they can, and they receive the same price irrespective of the market price. So they will produce all the time. And in some instances, the demand less their production will be lower than the installed generation capacity. So the producers will be willing to sell at a price lower than their variable cost, and even at a negative price. So they'll just say, look, we'll take whatever price you give us, so they don't have to shut down and start up again. And particularly in the case of nuclear power plants, there's a minimum capacity, and the nuclear producers are willing to receive negative prices rather than shut down and start up. And of course, that's economically inefficient, because if the price is negative, it means that the marginal value of the megawatt hour is negative, which means that it shouldn't be produced. But that's the way it works. Negative prices are reality in Germany when there's a lot of renewables. It's also a reality in Texas, where there's a lot of renewables. And that the question for Marcus, this is all driven by subsidizing renewables. All of the paper, all of the description from the paper is about subsidies for renewables. By subsidies, to be very clear, I mean, in the model we describe a setup where the government guarantees a rate to the renewables. So that would be a tender, a public tender, like the one we had in the UK, well, actually not exactly, like ones we have in Europe quite frequently, where we say, we want 10 gigawatt of wind turbines to be built. We auction off the rights to build these turbines, give us a price, and we'll pay you this price. So there's bidding on the price. What happens is that the price that the generators receive is guaranteed over time. So that would be the subsidy, and that price may be higher than the market price. So that's what we studied with no subsidies for gas and coal. So that's the setup. A bit of notation, which is not particularly important. The couple of things that you need to know: we have incumbent technologies. we have a state of the word theta, and what matters is to understand that the technology, the renewable technology, which is indexed by I, the renewable technology doesn't produce the same amount at every hour. And we acknowledge that some technologies will be available 100% in some hours, but the same technology will be available only 0% in some hours. So if you think about solar panels will produce 100% during daytime and will produce 0% at nighttime. So this alpha I is 1 during daytime and 0 during nighttime. By contrast, and that's a very important point, the conventional technologies are dispatchable and controllable. So the production of the dispatchable technology, the controllable technology, is decided by the market maker, by the system operator. And UN in the state theta measures the decision, the dispatch, that is the decision of the market maker. And that's very important. That's the key difference. Renewables technology, you cannot control how much they produce. The wind blows, the sun shines or not. Dispatchable technology, you can control how much it produces. And we have an inverse demand, which simplifies the math, but it doesn't really do much. The first condition that is important, you have a spot price. The first thing I want to draw your attention, this is an equation on the board, but beyond the equation, what's important is the intuition. It's called the free entry condition. It means that in a long-term equilibrium, that is, when all the dust settles, in every year, the operating profit of every plant, which is the price minus the variable cost times the production, the operating profit per unit equals the fixed cost of the plant. That's the long-term equilibrium condition. So of course, we're never at the long-term equilibrium, but that is a useful benchmark. The power system is balanced where every plant covers exactly its fixed cost, but no more and no less. If a plant was to cover more than its fixed cost, that is, create profits over its fixed cost, then that would invite entry. But on the other hand, if a plant was not covering its fixed cost, it should lead to exit. Now, in reality, of course, matters are more complicated, and some plants may not cover the fixed cost for a while, expecting things to go better. That's the boom bust cycle. And in Australia, you have lots of mining industry, so be familiar with the boom bust cycle. I'm just describing the long-term equilibrium for you because it's important in the analysis. So that's free entry and generation. Now let's talk a bit about renewables and the subsidy. The theory is that as you build more renewables, the cost of building renewables is going to come down. And that's the purple line or the bluish line you see on the top, which goes down, starts at about 400. And then, as you increase capacity on the x-axis, you see that the cost goes down. That's learning by doing. The guys who build the first wind turbine, they spend a lot of time designing it. The guys who come after them, they can learn from what the previous guys have done. We can build better, bigger turbines, and so on and so forth. And then the cost per kilowatt per year is decreasing. And that has been observed when you look at all the learning curves. You've seen some of them learning curves. When you look at them, that has been observed empirically. Wind turbines, we used to make them 3-4 gigawatts. Now, offshore wind turbines are going to be, we're talking about 15, 16 gigawatts. I've heard some plan to get to 20 gigawatts with 20 megawatts, megawatts wind turbines, which are pretty big turbines. So that's the curve, of course, has been going down. Now, the the purple pinkish line is the market value of renewable energy. That is, if you build a wind turbine, I'm going to use the wind turbine example here. If you build a wind turbine, it's going to cost you, let's say, 300 or 400 pounds per kilowatt per year. However, the megawatt hours you're going to sell into the market may not cover the construction cost. So the subsidy is going to be the difference between the construction cost and the market value of the megawatt hour produced. And in the example I'm giving you, you can see that the construction cost is exceeding the market value of the energy for a while. And then at some point it stops, and then you don't need to subsidize anymore. And that's the hope, that at some point, the construction cost of the wind turbine is going to go lower than the market value of the renewable energy. So renewables will become economical and will not need to be subsidized. So far, it hasn't happened. I've not seen that yet. There are some examples of fully merchant renewables. I think there's one in Chile, but in Europe, the way we think about it today, producers are hesitant to go full merchant on renewables. And I see there's a question. You guys still subsidize coal-fired power plant. Well, the thing about, and that's a broader comment on global warming and the fight against global warming. And that goes a bit beyond the purpose of this talk, but that's an important topic for all of us. Fighting global warming is a complex issue, and unfortunately, we don't see enough traction on that issue, and it's something that we do give a lot of thoughts about as economists, as academics, as practitioners, and we feel that there's a disconnect between what the economics and the science tells us and what is done in practice, and somehow the policy that are enabled, that are enacted, fall short of the challenge. That's our view, and our sense is that the problem is that there's not enough discussion and discourse around what is the problem and what are the solutions that we could give to that problem, and that's a shame. We have the same issue in Europe. Germany relies heavily on coal. Poland, of course, relies heavily on coal, and they have a very difficult time phasing out coal, despite their understanding, and Germans certainly do understand the need to fight global warming, but have a very hard time phasing out coal, and that's a challenge. I'm not going to talk about the cumulative subsidy. There's a bit of math. We can map that up. I think there's a couple of points that are more interesting. The first issue is what happens to demand when you increase renewables. When you increase renewables, as I said, renewable subsidy, which is a little era that we saw, has to be financed by a tax, right? Because you want to subsidize someone, so somehow the money has to come from somewhere. And in the model, we assume it's an excise tax. That is, that everybody in the market pays a bit more for power. And that bit more, which is a unit tax, is used to finance the subsidy. So far, so good. In general, there are some cases where it doesn't work, but in general, as you increase renewable capacity, well, you increase the amount of subsidy that is required. And as you increase the amount of subsidy that is required, you're going to have to increase the tax. If you increase the tax, people are going to see a slightly higher price for power, and demand is going to go down. And that's the equation of the board. And that's a very robust insight if you increase subsidies for renewable, power is going to get more expensive, and that's going to reduce demand. And that's something we see in a lot of industries. I'm going to give another example, which is slightly different, but that's going to give you the same intuition. If tomorrow we mandate electric vehicles in Australia, well, electric vehicles being a bit more expensive than combustion engine vehicles, the price of cars is going to go up, and therefore you'll see less cars on the road. So that's the same intuition that we see applying here. That's very important. Yep. I see there's a question. Can you say something about what happens when the subsidies goes to residential PV? It's the same thing. The question here is not where the subsidy goes. The question here, what we try to capture here is that there is a subsidy, and that subsidy is going to be paid by everybody. And because we assume that customers are responding to prices, as the subsidies increases, the price of power increases and demand goes down. Whether it's solar PV or not, it's the same impact. Now, in the case of residential PV, there's a second effect that kicks in, which is because I have a residential PV, I'm not buying my power from the grid. So I'm paying less for power, right? Because I'm buying less from the grid. So the subsidies that I have to pay is not going to be applied to my entire demand, but it's going to be applied only to a portion of my demand. So that's what we see here. And that's renewable PV for you. Any other questions? I just need to tell my daughter that she's on camera and then she's being seen in Australia. She just woke up and she's starting making breakfast behind me. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what is the impact of renewables on existing production capacity? Yes, coffee would be nice, Diane, I understand. No, I'm actually on the phone, I am. That's all right. You're being watched in Australia, by the way. So let's look at a very simple system. And I'm going to try to explain what happens when you have renewable enter a market. So let's take the simplest demand setting where you have two periods, on peak and off peak. On peak demand is about 100, off peak demand is 50. And you have two technologies. One technology is baseload, and the other technology is peaking technology. So you're going to build baseload technology to cover your on-peak demand. So you're going to build 50 of baseload technology. And you're going to build your peaking technology to cover the peaking hours. So peaking is going to be 50. Now, let's suppose you have renewable that enter the market. And for the sake of argument, you create 30 of renewable, but the renewables, they are uncorrelated to demand. So they enter the same amount on peak and off peak. So that's the renewable. So in the long-term equilibrium, you're going to need only 20 of baseload, and the peaking production is going to be unchanged. The peaking capacity. So the first insight is that if renewables technology produce all the time, at every hour, they are not correlated to demand, they push out the baseload technology and do not affect the peaking technology. And that's the first insight. And I do the math to prove that if you care to see that. And we did the analysis for the United Kingdom. So we looked at the different technologies. So the bottom line, the bottom blue line is the nuclear capacity. Then the surface between the red line and the A blue line is the combined gas cycle. Then the surface between the green and the red is the open cycle peaking turbines. Then the surface between the purple and the green is the open cycle, and then you have offshore wind. So this is the Saudi Arabia of wind. A lot of wind capacity that's being added to the market. The plan is about 60 gigawatts of wind capacity, which is enormous. It's almost doubling of installed capacity in the UK with a lot of wind. And a lot of that growth comes from the offshore, as you can see here. Now, what you also see is that as wind capacity increases, you can see that the nuclear capacity decreases. And that's exactly the intuition I gave you, which is that wind in the United Kingdom is about a baseload technology. It produces about every hour because of the diversification. So it's a baseload technology. Hence, it pushes out the other baseload technologies, which in that case is nuclear. And that creates a conundrum for the British government, which is we want to decarbonize our energy mix, want to produce with less CO2, emit less CO2 as we produce electricity. But by pushing one carbon-free technology, which is wind, the other technology that you're pushing out is your other CO2-free technology, which is nuclear. So in the end, you're going to have to, if you want to have only wind and nuclear, you're going to have to subsidize both. And that's what we see in the United Kingdom. That's one example. Let's now look at another example where, for example, renewables produce only during on-peak hours. And then you can see that the baseload technology is not impacted, and it's the peaking technology that is impacted. So one of the insights here, there are two insights. One of the insights is that the impact of renewables on the incumbent technology at the long-term equilibrium, is, when capacity adjusts to cover their costs. That impact is not uniform. It depends on when the renewable technology is produced. So if you have a wind turbine producing at about every hour of the year, it's going to have a different impact than if you have a solar panel producing only during daytime. And we need to understand that, and we need to prepare for that and not just hope that things will work out magically. That's number one. The second issue, which is related to that peaking technology, is the duck shot curve. I'm pretty sure you've seen it. This is actually the original version. I've looked at the update and it still works, but this one is nicer. And this comes from the United Kingdom, from the California. This is not covered by our paper with Richard, but I think that's a very significant, important issue that you guys need to take into account as you think about renewables. The curve shows you the residual demand, net of renewable production over the course of one particular day. So you see 0 to 23 are the number of hours, and this is the demand in California in megawatts. So in 2013, you see you have demand around midnight. It goes down as people go back to sleep. It's about flat during the day, and it goes back up in the evening. That's an evening peaking system where people go back home, they cook, and it goes back up, and then it goes back down during the night up until about 17 at the bottom. That was the situation in 2013. Now, progressively, they increase renewable production, essentially solar panels. While solar panels they produce during the days, that is between 8 o'clock and about 5 p.m., 8 o'clock in the morning, 5 p.m. That's what the solar panels are producing. So the net demand, the residual demand goes down, 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 down. And you see by 2020, the low residual demand goes down to 11,000 megawatts at 2 p.m. And that created another problem, which we haven't modeled with Richard, which I think is really important, which is the problem of ramp down and ramp up. And ramp up is probably the easiest to see. Between about 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., you have to go from 11 to 25. So you need to have 14,000 megawatts of power producing from starting to produce, ramping up from about between 3 to 9 to 7. So that's a very big issue that needs to be addressed. So here you see the need for price flexibility. That is, you need the need for flexibility. Flexibility can be achieved by prices. If you put the price of power lower at 2 p.m., people may consume a bit more. If you put the price of power higher at 7 p.m., people will consume less. So the ramp up speed that you'll need to have will be lower. That's one thing. So dynamic pricing is going to become increasingly important. You also need storage. You need flexible capacity. And that's a very important issue. As you increase the size of renewables in your market, you increase the variations among hours, and you need more flexible production. You need more flexible demand. You need more flexibility into your market. And that's one piece of the puzzle we're still struggling with. I think we are very comfortable that the cost of renewable technology has come down. So renewable production is now very competitive, standalone. But when you integrate renewables into the system, you have additional impact effects, such as the need for flexibility. And here, more work needs to be done to get that flexibility going. I think we're going, there's a lot of math going. The last thing I want to show you, and then I'm going to open for questions, is that as you increase the capacity of renewables, the value that the megawatt hours of renewable that they generate goes down. And I'm trying to explain that to you on a simple example. If you have one wind turbine, it's going to produce at every hour a certain amount. And there's going to be a price in the market. And the value of a kilowatt of installed capacity is going to be the price at every hour times the production at every hour. Now, suppose you had a second wind turbine next to the first one, and nothing else changes. You just change this thing. Well, at every hour, there are going to be 2 wind turbines producing instead of 1 turbine. And because nothing else has changed, the price is going to be lower at every hour. So the second turbine is going to have a lower value than the first because it's going to receive a lower price. But the value of the first turbine will also be lower because it's going to receive a lower price. So if you put 2 wind turbines exactly one next to one another and nothing else changes, adding a second turbine will reduce the value of the first, and the second turbine will get a lower value. And that's the analysis, and we can prove that mathematically, and we verify that. And at some point, the nuclear goes off, and then bad things starts to happen. I see there are more questions. Okay, Mark has a question on renewable generating power at a steady state. And there are two, that's a very good question, Mark, and I'm going to try to answer it. When you look at, there are 2 things. One is whether renewable produces constantly at every hour, or whether it produces at some hours and not others. And the analysis we present to you assumes that renewables do not produce the same at every hour. So that's the example I'm giving you here. You see renewables in my little model here, they produce only on peak. So they are not producing steadily, as in the same amount at every hour. So this analysis incorporates the fact that renewables produce at some hours and not. Now, the other issue you raise is the issue of predictability. So do I know today what my renewable production will be tomorrow? Will I know tomorrow at 2 p.m. what my renewable production will be at 4 p.m.? And that's the issue of unpredictability of renewables, and that the model doesn't address. It's a much more complex analysis to integrate stochastic or random renewables into a power system, because there you need much more flexibility, not only to compensate for the known variation, wind produces during the day but not at night, so that's a known variation, but you also need to compensate for the unknown variation, which is, well, maybe at 2 p.m. it will produce 100, maybe it will produce only 80. And that requires even more flexibility, and it's much more complex. So I'm done, and I think I'm going to take some Q&A now, some questions. Capacity, market, and payments. Greg, this is an excellent question. And this is, I think, one of the most challenging questions in market design. You are absolutely right. If you put capacity market, you will dampen power prices, because generators will receive a part of their payments from the capacity market, and there will be lower price fluctuation, spot price fluctuation. You're absolutely right. And that will dampen the incentives in the spot market for everything we hold dear, which is demand response, energy storage, and so on and so forth. Energy storage, I mean, the value of those assets or the value of demand response is not when the price moves from 10 to 15, it's when the price moves from 10 to 1,000. That's when you see the value of storage. And if it moves from 10 to 1,000, you don't need that many hours at 1,000 to cover the capacity cost of storage. So on the one hand, we want to have a very volatile spot price that reflects supply and demand conditions to create incentive for flexibility solutions. Flexibility being demand response or being storage. So on the one hand, we want that to get that flexibility in the spot market, in real-time markets. On the other hand, and that's a challenge we all are facing, if you get very volatile spot prices, investors are very reluctant to finance new power plants because they see those volatile spot prices and they wonder what's going to happen. So as an economics professor, I can come to them and tell them, well, look, that volatility that you see in the spot price, it's mostly weather related. It's completely uncorrelated to your market. It doesn't change your beta. You need not worry about it. But they just look at me and say, I don't believe you. And that stops the conversation. So on the one hand, you want very volatile spot prices, but the other hand, when you have very volatile spot prices, you don't see a lot of investments, or investors are very reluctant. And therefore, they say, no. Precisely because the prices are volatile, you need to give us some insurance. But if we give some insurance, the prices lose their volatility, and we don't get the signal for flexibility. And that's where we stand right now in Europe and in North America, where you have those capacity markets that reduce the volatility of spot prices and that create disincentives for flexibility precisely where we need more flexibility. And that's an area of research that is still ongoing. I don't have the solution. I know a lot of good people are working on it, but I think it's a very complex issue to solve. And just to add on that, I think it's very complex to solve theoretically, not straightforward, but it's even more complex to solve politically. And again, that's one of the points I make in the book. Guillaume was kind enough to purchase my book, which is really nice, and to show it to you. The challenge we have in the electricity industry is that sometimes the economics can be a bit tricky but also the politics are very difficult because you have vested interest, because you have past dependency. So you can't really just say, look, I got the answer, this is what you need to do. You have to get it through the political process, which is fairly legitimate because we live in democracies, which is good. But that makes the problem harder to solve, much harder to solve. Another question. Demand of thereby requiring more flexibility. Okay, so the introduction of electric vehicles, that's a very good one. The Salman, the current view, that's the view. I'm not sure it seems reasonable, but I would, that's the current view. People view electric vehicles essentially as a stabilizing force on the market because they think that electric vehicles are going to be used as decentralized storage units. So you leave in the morning, you take your electric vehicle, you go home, you go to the office, or you do whatever. I don't know if we'll go back to the office now, but in the old days, you would go to the office. Your vehicle charges in the office, you get home. And then when you get home, you plug your electric vehicle, and your electric vehicle is going to be used when you're home. At those hours when you're home, you're going to discharge the battery of your electric vehicle to make up for the winter peak, for the night peak, for the evening peak. And your electric vehicle is going to discharge and sell power back into the grid. In practice, you're going to use the battery of your electric vehicle for your own appliances. And then at night, your electric vehicle is going to recharge when you're not using it. And instead of, so instead of going all the way up and down like that, it's going to go all the way a bit less up, and then it's going to flatten for a while. That's the theory about electric vehicle used as decentralized storage unit. There are hundreds of startups. I don't know about Australia, but in California, there are hundreds of startups that do what they call V2G, vehicle to grid, which optimizes the discharge of electric vehicles. So we think it's actually going to be good for solving the flexibility issue. The model is the shifting of interest. Does it mean that we only need to add a time variable to the answer? That's the model we use is a very simple model. What we say is that the demand, and again, that's a very simplified model that gives us the result at a cheap cost. What we say about the demand curve is that the slope of the demand curve doesn't change. That is that, if you increase the price by one, no matter which period, the reduction in demand is the same. However, depending on the state of the world, depending on the hour of the year, the intercept changes. That's a very simplified version of the demand curve. First, we assume demand is linear, and second, we assume the intercept is constant. You can do marginal demand modeling. It doesn't change much of the insight. Most of the insights are captured here. Okay. Are there more questions? I think we have a bit more time.
There is a bit more time. So if there are more questions, now is the time to ask them. So I do have one. So it's kind of a question or comment. So you talked about capacity markets, and you talked about the need for volatility, which at the same time is deterrent for investors. But batteries like this volatility, right? They trade on this, or they have the ability to trade on this. And so it doesn't seem to be true to say that it's universally bad. If I'm a battery investor, I want that volatility, don't I?
No, absolutely, you're right. I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. You're completely right. I misspoke. The batteries investors want the volatility. Absolutely. The flexibility investors want the volatility. So the guys who are going to come to you and say, Guillaume, I can help you manage your demand. And I'm going to be an aggregator of demand. I'm going to help you resell your power into the market when the price is high. Those guys love volatility. So you're absolutely right. The flexibility guys love volatility. The producers, the guys who build plants, they don't like volatility as well. Now, there's a continuum, right? Because you could say, well, okay, I understand the storage guys like volatility. But maybe the open cycle guys, the guys who build peaking units, they also strive on volatility. So they should like it. They do, but they like it less than the battery guys. Now, the combined cycle people, of course, the combined cycle people, again, they benefit to some extent from the volatility. So they should like it, but they like it a bit less. And of course, the baseload guys like it even less. So you have a continuum of, if you want, like or dislike of volatility. And most of the traditional producers, the guys who produce with very high fixed costs, for example, the renewable guys, they have only fixed costs. They don't really like volatility, and the baseload guys don't like volatility. So, and you're right, and I should have been more careful when I say the word like. You can prove to them that economically volatility is good for them, and they can see that intellectually, but then they have to go to financing. They have to leverage to get debt to finance their project. And volatility, when you get debt, is not a good idea. So you get this imperfection in the market, in the capital market. But you're right. The battery guys, they love volatility. Other questions? No, Greg has a question about ancillary services. We do not cover ancillary services. This is, as I said, a completely different model that is much more complex to solve. So in our model, we do not explicitly cover ancillary services or frequency voltage control. The easy way to cover for that is you increase demand by a certain percentage, and we can replicate the analysis for that. The technically correct way, but it is much more complex to do, is to do a fully dynamic hour-by-hour model, and then you get different results. By the way, the people who do the math correctly by looking at a dynamic model, and some guys have empirically examined that you cannot really do the math, the theoretical equations as we derive them with the full model, but you can do it numerically, and they find that the results that they obtain are very similar to the ones we obtain on the simpler model. It's not, of course, exactly identical, but the direction of travel is the same if you want. There's a question for Glenn. Does onshore wind in the UK still require subsidy? The answer is yes, but it's getting to be tricky. The way onshore wind in the UK, well, actually, I don't really know about onshore wind in the UK. I know about offshore wind. I think the onshore wind still requires a subsidy. Just say a word on offshore because it's interesting. The way the government does that, the British government, the British Crown does it, is they auction off the rights, the leases, if you want. They auction you off the right to build an offshore wind turbine. So you have to pay today to get that right. So that increases the capital cost of building the wind turbine. And in a way, I guess most of the developers expect that they will get a power purchasing agreement that will cover the capital cost they pay for the lease. So my guess is you will still see subsidies in the offshore wind, but a portion of that subsidy is going to be explained by the fact that the developers have to buy the lease on the ground. So you see, as the technology becomes cheaper, you have the lease cost that you need to add, and it probably will end up being subsidized. There's something about Inclay C. Inclay C, as you know, is developed by EDF, which is my employer. There was a big discussion about Inclay C, and I was not at EDF. Yes, I was an economist, and I was advising EDF and saying, look, guys, you need to understand that if you have a lot of renewables coming into the market, at some point, Inclay C will no longer be able to run at full capacity. And they've told me, well, this is all well and done. This is good. This is theory. In practice, we're confident it's going to still work. Possibly, probably. You know, the model we built with Richard was very theoretical and very stylized. But you are absolutely right to point out that Inclay C might be able to run at full capacity over time. However, at some point, the British government will have to face the fact that the wind turbines are going to push off the nuclear fleet. So maybe they'll build a couple of them, but if they build too many of them, by 2050, they'll find themselves with competing sources of energy. And that's the point also I want to raise, which I think is critical, is that there's always a mismatch. Well, not always, but there's often a mismatch between what economics tells you and what politicians do. As economists, I can sit here and tell you, well, look, wind in the UK and nuclear are going to become competitors at some point. There are substitute technology. They will compete against one another. You will find yourself having to face that. And politicians are going to answer to me, well, look, it's going to happen in 2030, 2040. That will way beyond the end of our mandate. So let's just not worry about it now. And again, the story about power markets is the tension between what economics tells you, which is not always clear cut, but we have pretty robust insight, and the political economy of things, which is, among others, then politicians have a mandate, and at the end of the mandate, they don't really care much what happens. And I think we're about time.
We're about time. So thank you so very much. Perfect timing,
Thank you,
Thomas. I hope that we get to meet. Normally we take you out to dinner. Of course, it's not quite dinner time where you sit, but hopefully we can
see my daughter.
Breakfast, absolutely. So hopefully we can welcome you one day to Melbourne and host you for real. But
I'd love to.
Thank you so very much for your insights, and we'll see you again very soon, I hope.
I hope so. Thank you very much for having me, and have a great afternoon and evening. Thank you.
And you have one wonderful day. Thanks very much. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye.